All right, hi everyone. We're going to start off just by giving brief introductions of ourselves so you know who we are, what we've done in VR. So as Steve said, I am McNeill. I made a game called Darknet. It's like a cyberpunk hacking game that is out right now for the Samsung Gear VR and coming eventually to the Oculus Rift whenever that comes out.
Cool. Hi everyone. My name is Kane. I'm part of the team working on a game called Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes. It's a cooperative bomb defusing game. And we've got it running on Gear VR and DK2, and we've also had some experience with Project Morpheus.
I'm Hart. I transitioned from doing web video in rectangles to thinking rectangles aren't going to be a thing. So now I run a research group called Ella VR. We mostly do video stuff, 360 spherical video research, trying to figure out how to do that, and now a lot of web stuff as well using web VR.
My name is Holden. I've worked on a bunch of really silly VR games, like a Night at the Rockulus and SMS Racing. I founded a VR studio in January called Turbo Button, where we're trying to see if we can, to Steve's point, run a studio just off of making VR games. So we'll see how it goes.
And I'm Geiger. I produced a Gear VR title called The Blue VR at a company called Wemo Lab, which is now called Weaver, and also dabbled a little bit with some DK2 stuff. And we were in the room, I guess, on the Vive stuff, the HTC Valve headset collaboration. And full disclosure, I'm also working with Mr. Swink on a game called Scale.
So I think when we set up this panel, none of us really expected that this was going to be the VR conference. And it's kind of cool. There have been like all these announcements of different platforms sort of coming to the fore recently. So I think we should start out by talking sort of about our experiences and expectations for these various VR devices and platforms. Like, what are you developing for? How do you make sense of this whole environment? Max, you want to start?
Sure. I don't have a very concrete handle on everything. I mean, the recent announcements are super exciting, and I think where we are is a bit of a Cambrian explosion in terms of VR platforms and technologies. Having seen the Valve HTC prototype firsthand, although I mean it was like 4 months ago, so who knows how good it is now. It was super awesome then, and so I'm incredibly excited for its potential now. But having worked on the Gear and seen what mobile VR can do and the possibilities of the Gear sequel that we're seeing, I think it's a tremendously exciting time, and there's a lot of great things happening in terms of platform development and technology development. But at the same time, part of why I think it's a Cambrian explosion is that we'll probably see a die-off in a couple of years as the dust begins to settle and standards start to fall in place. That could be very ignorant, though. I'm getting like some very doubtful looks from my fellow panelists.
I think that right now we're seeing this split between mobile VR and PC VR, and I think it's likely that those are going to start getting a lot closer together. The further along that mobile gets. But something that I didn't really expect when I was coming into this was how much I would actually like mobile VR. The Gear VR is very limited in terms of what it can do, but it's a really great device. And it's been awesome, like just in the little bit of time I've been here at GDC, to be able to pull out a VR demo like you would pull out a mobile game and just be able to show it to anybody on the spot. And it actually makes all of the technology a lot more approachable, too. So even if the mobile side of things doesn't represent the best experience yet, I think that it has a chance at being the most approachable part for VR. So I think that the success of mobile is pretty important to the success of the PC side right now, I would say. And so I'm looking at all of these platforms with excitement and wanting to see them all succeed as much as possible, of course, but particularly focusing on the mobile side.
Yeah, several of us have done work for the Gear VR right now because that's the one that's actually like out. And you can tell it's sort of an immature platform, in part because it was kind of unclear at the beginning whether it's really a consumer product or whether it's like a development kit, and they sort of settled in between calling it an innovator edition. You can also tell it's still in its early days because my game is out for Gear VR and has been for a few months, but there was no payment solution on the store. So I essentially was just giving away the game for free until I'm allowed to actually charge people for it. And apparently, I'm allowed to charge people for it as of this morning, which I found out by logging onto Reddit.
Woo!
Yeah. So you know, it is like progressing, but you know, early days.
Yeah, for all of those reasons, both the diversity of this huge explosion of hardware that who knows what's going to actually end up being the thing or how many things will end up being the thing, and also for the reasons you mentioned, that the approachability of mobile is why I've been doing a lot of web VR stuff recently. That way I don't have to worry so much about the hardware. The teams, the Mozilla team and the Chromium team are kind of taking care of that aspect of things in making sure that if you can make a web VR website, it's going to run in whatever the standard devices are. And then I just get to make stuff, and instead of having someone download something from some closed platform, or is it available on this or that, I can just say, go to this website, and it's there.
Which I think is super important. Well, yeah, I don't know if we want to do a different question, but I think this is one of my big worries, actually, and you're touching on it a little bit, is making sure that the platforms stay open. That the big VR standards and solutions are not going to be owned behind a walled garden, so to speak, by somebody like Facebook or somebody like Valve.
Agreed.
Ben, I know you've worked with Morpheus a little. Can you talk about that?
So Morpheus has been pretty interesting. It's neat because Morpheus is supposed to be having a big event tomorrow, so I don't actually know how it's going to change. What we've been doing with Morpheus was fairly simple to do. Our game is based in Unity, so as far as technical problems go in integrating with Gear VR and DK2 and Morpheus, it's all fairly straightforward. It's manageable. We can handle supporting these different platforms. And really, we just try to work on our game. So although we support Morpheus, it's still just a headset to us that supports positional tracking, and we use a gamepad as input. Other than that, like we pass everything off to whatever library we're given. And as long as we can continue to do that, whether it's on Morpheus or Gear VR or DK2 or something new like HTC's headset, then we can continue to support all of this stuff. It's a little bit of extra work if they're not using all kind of one common sort of middleware, but it's still not that much work. So even as a team of 3, we can still manage to support these things.
I also know you had some thoughts on like trying to build for both non-VR and VR at the same time, and like whether that's a good decision or not.
Yeah, so we talked about this a little bit in advance, and the idea of should you develop for VR and non-VR at the same time came up. And I have flip-flopped on this repeatedly, because I think it kind of comes back to really a core idea of how much risk can your little indie company take. If you're a small group of people and you're banking on VR just being a thing in the near future, that might be pretty risky for you. When we started working on our game a year ago, the VR landscape was really quite speculative. We were thinking that Oculus would come out with something soon, and it ended up taking a lot longer than we figured. Even today, it seems more like what is going to be coming out. It's not, is something going to be coming out, but how many different players are there going to be? How many markets are you going to have to support? So it's confusing in that sense, but we want to make a VR-first title and hope that it works out for us. If we don't support VR, we feel we're losing out on something that's really core to our game. And although that might mean we could hit a non-VR market and a VR market, it comes down to your appetite for risk and whether or not you can afford to support VR.
Yeah, and I think it's one nice thing is that Oculus and Sony and Valve all seem to be pretty indie-friendly. And you know, Valve and Sony I've heard about sort of secondhand. Oculus I've had some like first-hand experience with. First of all, they ran the VR Jam in 2013, and that's kind of what like got me actually started working in VR. And now they're running the mobile VR Jam with like $1 million in prizes. So if anybody out there can afford to spend the next 2 months working on a mobile VR game, that might be a cool way to you know, dip your toes in the water. And the other thing Oculus did that is a sure way to get my friendship is they funded me. So they referred to it as a co-publishing agreement, and essentially Oculus offered me an advance on royalties, so I do have to pay them back, in exchange for time-limited exclusivity of my game. And so essentially, Ben was talking about like your appetite for risk. I really don't have much of an appetite for risk, but I wanted to work in VR. And so this was sort of, I thought, a very fair way to reduce that risk. It sort of put a floor on the returns that the game could make and turned it from like a really stupid business decision into something that I could kind of justify. And then I spent all that money, making the game anyway. But, so let's talk a little bit about VR from a design perspective. Like, why are we working in VR? What special advantages does this technology afford? Like, what can we do with it?
Everything. I think of VR as being less of a medium and more as, it's virtual reality, and I'm much more interested in virtual unreality, how we can get away from trying to, why I am a little confused why people want to simulate realistic graphics all the time and be as realistic as possible when we have that in reality. I'm really fascinated by the unrealistic alternate spaces. I've been doing stuff with alternative geometries that we can put you in, that you can do in VR that you can't do anywhere else.
I was pretty much sold on it from the first time I put on a DK1. I said, wow, this is really cool. And at the time, I was already making mobile games and console games at my day job. So I just kind of embraced Oculus development as a passion project. And I would, every time a game jam would come up, I would make a VR game. And honestly, it just kind of grew into something from there. I found that when I was working on that kind of stuff, I would spend a weekend making a VR game, and then the next day, I would see that more people had looked at that on YouTube than everything else I had worked on previously in my life combined, and that's kind of a weird feeling, right? But that's kind of the power, I think, right now that the very small number of VR developers and VR games out there give you if you try to do something in this space and you can make something that resonates. So it might not be there from a financial standpoint, but it's a lot easier to stand out, and it's a lot easier to be able to figure out what the value of your work is as well in the community.
I think one of the things that VR does that is most interesting to me is that it privileges human-scale interactions in a way that other screens and other kinds of screens haven't really done yet, particularly with interactive media, where the things that look really good in VR or things that feel really good in VR, at least to me, are things that are slower and close up and take good advantage of the stereoscopic range of your eyes before everything converges out at infinity, and move with a certain intimacy and a level of detail that makes these worlds much more finely grained than I think a lot of the worlds we're used to seeing on a TV screen or a PC screen, which are where everything is happening so fast and so far away, and with a level of volume in terms of explosions and bullets and all of these things that really aren't pleasant in VR. So I think it's going to be a wonderful opportunity to start exploring new thematic ground, particularly as the games world continues to mature and get more interested in exploring these sort of subjective realities. That and just tripping really hard on crunchy Philip K. Dick Gnosticism of which reality am I in right now?
Oh, okay. So a lot like Holden, when we got DK1s, we were sold on the idea of virtual reality right away. But unlike him, we had absolutely no idea what to do with it. It took us about a year later until the Global Game Jam, where we decided to try to make use of one of virtual reality's sort of perceived weaknesses in the idea of isolating players from the rest of the world. And we didn't really know what we had stumbled on in that respect. We thought we were just making a neat thing that took advantage of the fact that they could see something different. And it turned out to be a much stronger effect than that. And the sense of isolation that you can get is something that we were able to sort of take advantage of in our design. And we had no idea that that was going to happen. Even for months after we had started showing off the game, people would come up to us and say, well, yeah, sure, couldn't you just do this on a tablet or a second screen? And we'd agree with them. We thought, totally fine, just use a separate screen. But it's taken us this much sort of prototyping and just being with people playing the game to actually recognize that it does make a difference to have someone in a space that they feel is completely different than the space that everyone else is in.
Yeah, I think that's a good point about taking the perceived weaknesses of VR, things like isolation, and turning them into strengths. I feel like with a lot of new emerging platforms, they're more convenient, or they fit into your life better in some way, and VR is absolutely not that. And so the fundamental challenge that we're facing as developers is justifying why people are going to buy this expensive headset and wear it and isolate themselves and all of that. So I feel like a VR game has to either do something that's completely unique to the platform, like taking advantage of that isolation or doing cool things with motion control like Vi's games or Holden's, like everybody else on this panel except me. Or what you have to do is make really good use of the enhanced immersion that comes with VR. And so I think there's certain types of games that make better use of that than others. And it can eventually go up to the buzzword of the day, which is presence. And I think that's probably worth talking about a little bit. I think presence, everybody seems to have their story of when they realized it, they were afraid to walk off of a virtual ledge, or they reached out for a railing that wasn't there, or something like that. And it's one of those things that sounds very mundane, and it doesn't lend itself well to verbal description, but it is really cool, and it's this magical moment of at some deep instinctual level feeling like you're in a different place. And I think that's awesome, but I don't know if that alone is going to sustain hours of gameplay or something. I don't know if that's enough to do that work I was talking about of justifying buying and wearing this headset. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I hear a lot of things that people say you can't do that I think are completely not true. So related to the things like, oh, people aren't going to want to put on this thing that isolates them or makes them look silly, or people aren't going to want to do this thing if they lose presence if you make a game like that, or you can't do hard cuts in VR cinema. There's all these things that people say you can't do, which are mostly not true at all. So if you're looking to do VR things and someone's saying, oh, no, you can't do that because whatever reason, I find that a lot of things have unexpected results when you actually try it. And this is why it's fun to be a research group. It's because we try all sorts of things and start to find that, when people wear a headset, they don't care that they look silly or that they're not in the same space as anyone else, or if the presence doesn't make them feel actually present because they're the wrong height or something like that, or hard cuts because we do a lot of film work. You can do quite a bit, and a VR-savvy audience is going to get used to things really fast, and you making games is going to make those audiences savvy in the things you make.
I think the point of trying things that a lot of people say aren't going to work is really important. If you look at Lucky's Tale, it's a 3D platformer that's coming out for the PC version of the Oculus Rift. Before that game, Oculus had in their recommendations to never change the IPD, which is the distance between the pupils of the player's eyes in the virtual world. And Lucky's Tale does exactly that. It scales the world, and it makes everything feel really small in front of you. And then Lucky's Tale got funded by Oculus, so breaking the rules worked out for them. But the rules are constantly being rewritten every day, and I think that's a huge attraction to the platform too, is we have an opportunity to establish a lot of conventions and come up with a lot of ideas that people are going to keep playing with for a while. And it's just this crazy field of experimentation right now of people figuring out what they think works, what they think doesn't work. And it's been very different for every people. I mean, every person. I think the closest comparison I can probably give is if you look at the first 2, maybe 3 years of touchscreen-based mobile games. A lot of them were people attempting to port over existing games onto those devices with virtual joypads and that kind of thing. And if you look at the landscape now, it's very little of that by comparison. A lot of new ways of interacting with games have come together, and the platform has really emerged on its own. And I think that's really what's happening right now with VR. So people are getting a chance to figure out what's working and probably start establishing some new genres. And I think over the next year, we're going to see some really interesting stuff come of that.
I would largely agree with that, and the example that I would use, which is a sort of a fuddy-duddy, non-interactive example, is the invention of cinematic language with the advent of cinema and people figuring out oh, we can start to move the camera and we can do cuts, and what's the Kuleshov effect? Oh, that's pretty neat. We can start to get a little bit more emotion out of it, and we're having to reinvent that kind of cinematic language for both VR cinema, but also the traditional interaction language that we've established in games for virtual reality experiences. And I think just like in cinema, if we look at VR 50 years from now, people will point back to stuff that's happening today and be like, yeah, that kind of worked, or okay, yes, they figured out this bit of the language that was eternal, and we're still using those techniques today. And then tastes will also shift because we're not the first generation of VR natives, right? We're going to sort of plow that field, and then the generation that grows up with this is going to be the one that does really incredible, mind-blowing stuff that will all be like, get off my lawn, I don't understand it, and it makes me sick. And as long as we don't make people sick, that's totally fine. And I think we're also in a very unique position as indies because I think the major platform holders, there's a little bit of a freedom, but also the tyranny of low expectations, where they're kind of looking to small indie teams to place bets and to try stuff out and to figure out the cool stuff. And you know what? It's no skin off their nose if a team of 4 guys in a garage fails, unlike if they place a $20 million bet and hire up a big team to go and do that. I'm perpetually ashamed of the idea that we're going to enter an age where we have the VR iFart apps, right? Or there are going to be all these interactions and experiences which are the equivalent of somebody's comment on a blog that's just like first, right? It's going to be like, oh, it's the first one of these in VR. But is that an experience that goes in VR?
Yeah, everything right now in VR has a first in front of it. It's the world's first. If you're not doing the world's first something, you can't put a headline on your article. It's just, yeah.
And that stuff, hopefully, history will sort of filter out a lot of that chaff from like the wheat of the good stuff that's being done now. But also, I mean, hey, maybe go ahead and claim that. I'm not going to sit up here and judge it. Well, I have sat up here and judged it, but go ahead and do it, right? Make iFart VR and keep somebody else from making their $1 million from it. Just don't be the guy who's like, I'm going to make Minecraft for VR. It's going to be awesome. Sorry to anyone making Minecraft for VR.
I made a little web thing for VR that's just like a giant text that says first, it's 3D, and it spins around, and as you look around, it like follows you, and it's called the world's first for VR. And then when you refresh, it iterates, so it's the world's first for VR. So that way, yeah.
So Vi, I know you've been doing some work on like VR video and things like that.
Yeah.
Can you comment on like the potential of like non-interactive versus interactive? Do you think that like VR is better suited for one or the other?
I think, like anything, people are going to want both. There's no reason why, once you're in VR, suddenly everyone's going to always want to be action moving all the time with their peripherals. Like, sometimes people are just going to want to sit down and chill out, just like in real life. So with VR video, and especially with mobile, I think the split between mobile and like PC or hardware-heavy things that can do really fast computation and compute all these games and your live rendering. But for mobile especially, I think video is going to have a lot of power because it's pre-rendered. Everything is beautiful. The story is going to be all there. And it can be a good story. It can be really immersive right away. People don't have to worry about controls they're unfamiliar with. And this whole interface, the story can grab them, and then they're in it, and they don't have to worry about all the unfamiliar stuff. So especially for VR noobs, cinema stuff, video, and on mobile is powerful.
And that's something that we definitely found working on the Blue VR. When we started out, we wanted to make a sort of fully interactive ocean exploration app where you could swim around and check out different parts of the environment of your own volition. And we found with a lot of play testing, especially with people who were having their first VR experience or people who were not video game natives, I guess people who had never sat down and held a controller for that 10 hours or whatever it takes to build that hand-eye coordination, that they just didn't want to touch it. They just wanted to be taken on a ride, and one of the things that's great about VR cinema is that people get to go on that ride or get to see and have a cool experience without having to worry about what their hands are doing, which is a very intimidating thing when you're wearing this mask for the first time and somebody's like watching you even though you can't see them, but you feel those eyes burning into you.
I do think it would be cool to have like some agency in terms of like exploration, and especially with like positional tracking. I really like the feeling of being able to lean in close to things. There's a lot of like exploration style games that I would like to have in VR, whereas most of the sort of non-interactive experiences I've had have felt sort of, like you said, Max, like a ride. I don't know, maybe like, I don't know, I'm at the game developers conference, so presumably we're sort of biased towards interactivity. But I am right now, I feel like that's sort of more exciting. Even though I definitely agree that like the whole action-y thing is not really well suited to VR right now.
I'm super biased towards interaction as well, and it killed all of us on the team, but we were just like, this is the data that we're getting out of play tests. Like, we got to pull it. Like, we can't do it any other way.
I've been doing some things that are both recently. So you have this beautiful world on your website, and there's some particles falling or whatever. Particles are great. If you can make a particle field, like, your game is going to be perfect in VR. Like, they're so good in VR. So you have these particles, and you can just chill out and listen to the music and look around, and it will be nice briefly if you're not used to VR, or you can use the gamepad and wander around and find stuff to do. But right now I'm like trying to mix everything. Like, oh, it works in VR and it works out of VR in your browser.
You're trying to do everything first in VR, like all these different combinations. Yeah. Ben, I know you had some thoughts on like different genres, applicability to VR, and like how well they can translate over.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about VR design is that a lot of things are kind of counterintuitive, or at least things that you think would work really well turn out to be a lot more complicated than you initially thought. I know when the DK1 first came out, people were thinking, let's just adapt all the first-person shooters to virtual reality, because you have mouse look, and you can change that to be head look, and that sounds fantastic. And then you forget the little details like, well, mouse look, you can kind of pick up your mouse and move it to the other side again. You can't really do that with your head all that well. Locomotion is also a huge problem. If you're running at 90 miles an hour in Doom, that's awful. But even if you're running at maybe 5 miles an hour in a regular sort of speed game, it's still really sickening for a lot of people. So the immediate idea of let's just lift genres that work well right now and put them in VR really just needs to be experimented with. It turns out that until you prototype a lot of this stuff, you just don't know how well or how poorly it's going to work in VR.
I think all of us have up here have likely had an experience where we're prototyping something and we make ourselves sick and then can't work the rest of the day. And that's actually something that you have to plan for if you're developing for VR, because it happens a lot more often than any of us would like, even when we think we know what we're doing with it. And I think maybe it's even a testament that we keep coming back to it, even when that happens, because it's. It is a learning process, but it's simultaneously one of the frustrating but also like really empowering things with VR when you find something that is really cool and really novel and doesn't make you sick. If it does those three things, then you have something really awesome for VR, and that's kind of I think what we all go for now.
Yeah, an early story on VR was saying if you thought QA testing was thankless before, wait until it's just like seeing if you throw up.
Yeah. On the subject of sickness, I found, there's some good guidelines out there that you should read. I think Oculus has one on, best practices to not make people sick. But I found that everyone gets sick for different reasons, and there'll be some little things that will make one person sick that won't make 100 other people sick. And for me, it's like I almost never get sick for anything, and then there'll be like that one thing that all of a sudden makes me sick for no reason, and it's like, why is this happening? And it's annoying because there's so many different reasons, and if you don't eliminate every single one of them, somebody's going to get sick, and probably someone's going to get sick anyway. But yeah, it's not enough to just have someone who usually gets sick say, oh, I usually get sick, I tried your game, and I didn't get sick. Like, that doesn't mean that your game isn't going to make other people sick.
All right, let's talk a little bit about input. A few years ago, we had like the wave of all these different motion controllers, and I didn't come out of that feeling like I particularly wanted to tackle motion control as like a challenge, especially on top of the already hard challenge of doing good VR. But now it looks like there's a lot of people who say that when they're in VR, they really want to see their hands, and they feel freaked out if they don't see that, which has not been my experience, but is widely reported. So what do you guys think about that? Holden?
So I mean, I've tried a number of different input solutions for VR, and I think that a lot of them are about 90% of the way there, and it's that extra 10% at the end that is the issue. And I actually do have the problem where if I'm like, if something is showing me my hands in VR and then my arm is suddenly behind my head, it does make me queasy. So I do have a bit of difficulty with that, but at the same time, I see enough promise in it and I have enough cool moments before I get sick that I see the potential there, and I'm very much excited for people who are much smarter than I am to be able to figure that out. I worked on PlayStation Move and Kinect games for a while, and I also know that motion control is very difficult even when you're not in VR. To make good motion controls, even like for 2D screens, was very, very difficult. And I think that it's only going to be more difficult for VR because you do have to more accurately reflect what people are expecting to see their hands doing based on how they feel. And you're going to have to incorporate things into their not only like where their hands are moving, but also figuring out like what is the size of the person that you're simulating, right? If they're looking out and they're seeing their hands, but their hands feel like they're too far in front of them, that's a weird calibration problem. And a lot of people will be really thrown off by that. So there's just a lot of stuff that's still to be determined, I think, with input. And very few people have actually shown, I think, what their input solutions are going to be going forward for VR. So that's all still very much in development. It might not even be here for the first round of hardware.
Yeah, I think just as much as the headsets have, in this moment of explosive diversity, the input solutions are even more varied with incredibly different levels of success depending on the application and how you're using it. And what you want to use it for and how it breaks down. And it's just going to be a nightmare trying to find a common standard because I think the segmentation that we're going to see from all the different kinds of controls and inputs could be a real barrier to entry for a lot of people, especially when most people, putting VR on for the first time just want to reach out, just want to use their hands, and nothing's really quite there yet.
I'm a big proponent of abstract input. There's a lot of great VR applications for seeing your hands and doing things that seem like you're literally doing a thing. And the first thing anybody does when they try VR is they put out their hands and they can't see them. And they're like, oh, I can't see my hands. Oh, I look down and I'm a tripod instead of a human. But people get used to that very quickly. People will get used to not having hands if your game doesn't have hands, although hand tracking is getting really good. It's going to be there soon, good hand tracking. But I love abstract input. Abstract input is the only thing that makes a first-person shooter fun. It's like that's what makes you superhuman. You're not limited by these meat flesh things. You can do all these fine motions, and then, for some games you need your hotkeys. You need lots of hotkeys really fast. You don't want to be literally directing armies. You want to just be pressing Control A or whatever. So I am looking forward to the type of abstract input devices that become invisible. You don't notice them. You're not thinking about your hands. You're not thinking about input. It's just happening, and what you want to happen is being expressed in your VR world.
Is that a description of a gamepad?
Of a gamepad? A gamepad is a pretty good abstract input device. I work with gamepads right now, just especially in VR. You can't see your hands. People are used to gamepads, and you can hook them up to a browser pretty easily. But I don't know. I want more than just a gamepad. I'm not exactly sure what that will be, though.
Yeah, we actually started with motion controls for our game and then have since moved on to gamepads just because that was more of a known quantity for new players. We figured we'd give them a gamepad and they can learn the rest of the VR stuff while still have something familiar. But then we got into kind of a similar problem where people expect to see their hands in VR. If we were trying to teach them the controls of the game and we said we could highlight a picture of the controller and say push A, they would look down, and now they're expecting to see a virtual controller. And it feels like we're going in the wrong direction, but I think we're actually going to have to put one of those in.
Yeah, my experience so far with motion controls for VR is there's a lot of them that are sort of 95% there, and 95% feels terrible. And even when it's working very well, you can reach out and pick up a virtual ball, but you will not feel a ball in your hand. And so, there's limitations there that, I think a lot of the marketing doesn't really express. All right, so let's move on. We've talked a little bit about this, but what are your thoughts on like indie VR development from a business perspective? You know, Steve sort of started us off with the question of like, can an indie studio survive on VR? What do you think?
Well, there's a Gear VR store now, so it might be possible.
As of this morning?
As of this morning.
Yeah, how are your day one sales?
I don't have stats yet.
Yeah, I think the question is a lot more appealing than it was this time last year. If you think about it, last year, GDC was, the unveiling of Morpheus, and then DK2 was coming out at the same time. This year, there seem to be a lot more options, and the promise of a marketplace for a few of them is at least sort of in the near future. Whether or not an indie studio can sort of survive with absolutely no sales, eating ramen noodles, whatever, for another however long it's going to take for these things to take off is going to be down to the studio themselves. But it seems like if you wanted to get in VR to specifically do VR, at least the solutions are foreseeable now.
I think the best case scenario you can be in if you want to be working in VR and self-publishing and self-funding a game right now is to have a game that also works outside of VR. There's simply not a market out there to support only doing VR stuff if you're trying to just sell it yourself. There is the Gear VR store, which literally launched today and only in the United States, I believe. So it's still very much coming together. It is all coming together very fast, though. So I agree that I don't think we're not that far. We're not terribly far away from it. I think that it's likely going to come together fast, but there are actually a lot of people who are willing to invest right now and fund VR content and VR games, specifically games. And I think that indies are particularly well suited to take advantage of some of that. So I know like a lot of developers will take on some contract work to fund their own titles, and there are a lot of people looking for small teams to build VR stuff right now. There are a lot of companies that are looking at it for the same reason that Facebook bought Oculus. They said that they felt like they were left out on mobile, and they wanted to make sure that they were an important part of this next platform if this is going to be like the next mobile. And so a lot of companies have that same mindset, and they're interested in being involved in VR. A lot of them are not wanting to make a full commitment, but something that indies would be able to take advantage of and do something really cool with. I think that there are actually a lot of opportunities out there, and it's probably, honestly, not any more, like from a realistic standpoint, I don't think that it's any more speculative or risky than trying to launch a mobile game as an indie right now, from that perspective, if you're going out and you're pitching VR stuff.
Yeah, I think having a VR game is sort of like something that people are curious about, and so it has that advantage. Like one thing that appealed to me about VR is that it felt like a smaller pond. It was scary, but not as scary as console or Steam or mobile right now. But that pond is also rapidly expanding because I keep on hearing about more and more people getting into VR, and it starts to, I still think that a one-person studio can make something that can hopefully stand out, but that also seems like it's going to be getting harder and harder pretty quickly. And I think there's also like an extra element of risk from the design perspective, because we sort of talked about how a lot of genres are not going to translate smoothly from 2D into VR. And so even if you're trying to do both at the same time, that might be harder than it sounds. And so you're sort of forced to innovate. You have to solve these problems if you're going to have something good that's worth playing in VR. And so you're stacking design risk on top of platform risk. You're going into it not sure if you can make something good, which is kind of always the case, but also not sure on top of that if the audience is going to be there for you. So, scary.
Yeah, so I am doing research, and I have research funding, so I don't really need to worry about funding my VR games. But since I've started doing this research stuff, I've gotten tons of job offers from large companies. So I think there's a lot of people, there's a lot of companies, everyone wants to be getting in on the VR thing. So if you can show you're capable of doing work for VR on your own independently, like the worst case is that you have to take on some contract work from one of the many companies who just want anybody who can make them something, because right now there's not a lot of people who can really actually create something and get it out there in VR.
So I would add that out of everybody up here, I think we've all been working in VR for about 2 years. Is that
1 year?
Yeah, 2 years or less, right? Like less for me as well. And we're considered experts in VR now. That is the field right now. There's not a lot of people with a lot of experience out there, and when there are other people who do have money available to fund games, they're looking for the very few people who have any experience right now. So it's there's absolutely a cool opportunity there, and even if it's on just a game jam or side project level, getting involved and playing around with it is potentially worthwhile, depending on what kind of things you want to make.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a gold rush, but it's also an opportunity to get in on the ground floor. And while the consumer-facing business opportunities aren't quite there yet, or are starting to get there, or will be here, before we know it, there's a lot of other opportunities working with, say, advertising agencies, or people who want to do installations, or production studios who can fund the cool thing. Those VR experiences at Comic-Con don't make themselves. And those people, there's more demand for that. So the people building those kinds of experiences will need the help to do it. So it's definitely viable.
I know, Ben, you had mentioned that your team was sort of like trying to focus on just like keeping costs really low and kind of reducing risk from that perspective, especially since like a lot of the platforms are still like on their way.
Yeah, so we are taking the approach of making a game that supports both VR and non-VR. We do think that the VR version is going to be superior. It'll offer the better experience, but technically it can still work without VR. Our concern with saying to people that you should support both, although that does mitigate risk if you want to like if you're afraid that VR isn't going to be a huge market right away, or it won't be a market for quite some time, you can mitigate your risk by supporting a non-VR version, and that could also help you reach a larger audience. But if you're really hoping to take advantage of VR and make like the VR experience, then I'm kind of the opinion that it can't be done outside of VR. Like if you are really taking advantage of the platform, then you shouldn't be able to make a non-VR version that is as good. So in a way, it kind of seems like if you try to mitigate that risk too much, you're going to end up not making the great VR experience that you hope to.
Cool. Let's talk a little bit about the future, which I guess we've been talking about the whole time. But I feel like VR draws a lot of comparisons to the advent of motion controls or the introduction of the App Store or micro consoles or whatever, depending on sort of the speaker's prediction of where this is all going. So as experts, where do you foresee VR going in the next year or two?
Web.
The web.
Web. I mean, the internet is like the internet of the VR is going to be the VR of the internet. Like it's yeah. How is everything not on the internet? How is anything not the internet? I don't understand this.
I mean, people have been like talking about the rise of HTML, games and browser-based games forever, and that still hasn't happened yet. I assume for a reason. So I mean, I don't know, but
yeah, I guess the money part of it, where people need to make money from things, it's easier to do that in some third-party store thing.
Do you think that's going to be
offline.
a problem for web-based VR?
Possibly, but the internet, like. There's going to be everyone's going to need to have a website in WebVR. So you go to the company's website and you're in, like we have a web demo where you go to our website and you're in our office. You're in like this 360 3D video of our office, and there's different floating bubbles of links that you can look at and click on. And someday we'll build that out and it will be our full website where you're in our office going through our office. And people are going to want that for their company websites. The web's going to get really interesting once a website is actually a web site. Think about it.
Well, what do you think makes it different this time around as opposed to the VRML stuff from like the 90s, where it was like, oh, let's build locations that are website phones?
Yeah, phones got tiny and cheap, and they can do stuff. So
that is true. Pocket supercomputers, pretty awesome.
Yeah.
So,
well, Ben, Holden, the future, tell us.
So hopefully it's the very near future for all of our sakes. But we're, I mean, like I think that, so I'm of the opinion then that VR does not really need a killer app. I think that term is really overused and it doesn't really mean much. But what's that?
Very 80s.
Right. But, specifically for VR, like, it doesn't need a killer app any more than film needed a killer app. It's a platform. It's something new, and there are going to be different things that different people really like about it. That said, if there is a killer app for VR, it's probably Netflix. Like, frankly, like, watching movies in VR and feeling like you're in, like, this giant theater is an experience that is out there right now, and that is the most accessible thing for people to look at in VR and for people to understand why it's cool. So I don't know that in the immediate future, I think we're going to see games be the biggest part of it. But I think long-term, games might not actually be the biggest part of VR. And I think that's okay. In the same way that we rely on televisions to play our games, that doesn't necessarily mean that video games are the biggest part of televisions for everybody. So I think that we need to be able to, in the future, we need to be able to look at what people are doing outside of games and figure out how we can be learning from each other, probably now more than ever.
I think it's another screen, and it has all of the opportunities and perils that come with that. Or it could just be, in like a year or two, a singularity will happen, and we'll just be sub-processing units of Peter Thiel's consciousness, and this is all a moot point. But for the next year or two specifically, I think we're going to see some big consumer plays at the end of this year, and hopefully the VR that makes it into the hands of a general audience won't just be a rich kid toy, and that people will be able to get to see it and experience it and get excited for it, and the demand will help drive the price down so that the next year comes out and we'll actually have affordable VR instead of like the equivalent of a Laserdisc player for AV junkies or something.
I think we'll probably see a lot of misguided attempts at adapting things to VR. We're going to see genres that maybe don't belong that people are going to experiment and try out anyway. We're probably going to see a lot of investment from large companies that maybe have nothing to do with gaming that just see VR as a thing that they should be a part of and not get left behind. We've already seen some companies that will, say, show a demo of a car that would normally be in a showcase, but they'll do it in VR. And that could work if the car doesn't exist, but if it does exist, why not show the actual car? So we're going to see some stuff that maybe isn't the best use of VR, and it's just sort of fumbling as people, like, honestly just stumble their way around and try to figure out what is VR good for and why should we actually be using it.
I'm of the opinion that VR is too cool to fail right now. Like it demos super well. Like the app that everyone seems to have figured out is the 2-minute VR demo that makes people say wow as they're leaving. But I think nobody's really figured out like the one that you could go in for hours, or that would make me feel good a year later about the purchase of one of these headsets. And so I think that's still sort of like the challenge to developers like us to try to actually accept this as a new medium. And that's difficult because that means that it's not just like an easy upgrade of like what we've all known and loved before, but better. It's actually something new that actually requires like genuinely new designs and new content for us to figure out first. So I think that's like the challenge for the developers in the room, and whoever figures that out wins the race. What about mobile VR, things like Google Cardboard? Does anybody think that that's going to make a space for itself, or already has?
Absolutely. I think mobile VR is an incredible way to experience short-form VR, in particular things like VR cinema, where the question of positional tracking within the experience hasn't been worked out yet, so the hardware not having any positional tracking isn't a detriment. And one of the incredible and amazing things about something like the Gear VR or Google Cardboard is the fact that you can just hold it up like a ViewMaster, have your experience, and then pass it to your friend who's right there with you, and then you can both talk about and share this experience, albeit in a serial fashion rather than a parallel fashion. But it really gives it's awesome. It's a lot of fun. It's going to be the new YouTube party. Mark my words. Give me a check.
I think that it's going to be the easiest way for people to experience VR. Especially once we get to a point like I think right now the Gear VR headset is $200. Those headsets are going to drop dramatically in price over the next couple of years, the ones that are based off of phones. So if people already have cell phones that are compatible with VR and they can get a headset for under $100, I think that you'll see the adoption skyrocket. And that's going to be really great for people to get not only a taste of what the PC versions are capable of, but it's actually going to be specifically great for indies because those devices are still phones at the end of the day, and they're not going to be pulling off some of the amazing graphics or other amazing features that we're seeing out of like AAA style games on maybe that the PC versions could support. They're going to have to be lower poly. They're going to have to be stylized. And I think that that's something that a lot of the industry has gotten away from, while indie developers have really allowed it to thrive in the last few years. So those kind of styles and that method of design works really well for mobile VR right now.
Amen.
It also adds to the burden of optimization, though. You know, like trying to get stuff running on a phone. You know, for Gear VR, you're running on a phone at 1440p at 60 frames a second, rendering twice every frame.
Once per eye, right?
Yeah, which is pretty difficult to pull off. So I feel like it's mobile VR is very promising. I think Gear VR is sort of like the minimum level that I can get excited about. Google Cardboard, I think, actually does deserve the comparison to a ViewMaster, and I think it's going to be used for approximately like the same amount of time. I have one, and you have to hold it up to your face, and something that I can only use to for a novelty experience for a minute at a time just isn't something that really gets me excited.
At the same time, I think Google Cardboard really fills a niche where people are curious about VR, especially mobile VR, and this gives them a way of trying it out without making a huge commitment. There seems to be a lot of fear around whether or not bad VR hardware can come out and sort of poison the well. And Google Cardboard is by no means a perfect VR experience, but it's also so cheap and sort of marketed in such a way that you wouldn't expect it to be, that people can try it out, not feel too bad about their investment, and still sort of have that curiosity about VR, but at the same time satisfy that curiosity enough that they're not going to go out and buy something else for quite a while. Like, they're okay to wait for more things to come out now that they've seen a little bit of what VR can be.
Google Cardboard's big strength, in my opinion, is that it's very much the, psst, hey kid, you want to try some VR? As opposed to I got to get a $200 peripheral for my $800 smartphone.
I love, echoing Ben. I love that it looks like cardboard. It looks really crappy, and when you see it, your expectations are immediately lowered. And then when you put it on somebody who's never tried VR before, it still is really awesome. And that shift and that realization for a lot of people gets them excited about VR. So it's great.
Yeah, I think the fact that it's made out of cardboard and called cardboard is why Oculus is cool with it, and why it's not going to poison the well, because it lowers those expectations. And I hope that it does sort of work to add to people's curiosity. It satisfies their curiosity about what VR looks like, but now they want to see the good stuff. They had that first hit.
Hey kid. Yeah. Also, ViewMasters are tight.
All right, we have about 5 minutes left, so I think we can take a couple questions from the audience. Cool. Go ahead.
First, I'd like to say thank you. It's been a fantastic panel. I want to touch back on the business topic for just a second. So how far out on each of your roadmaps is the point where the VR ecosystem can actually support a diverse group of indie-sized companies? And what do you define that point on, such as headset sales, game sales, or cardboards handed out?
I think if we were willing to disclose that information, we'd be making some smart investments, and we'd be starting an indie VR publisher, which, come talk to me after the No, I don't know. Also, shout out to Brad Herman, by the way. You are the maestro of DreamWorks' VR lab, right? So you're doing awesome work.
Thank you.
Everybody applause for this man. You owe him.
I think that right now something I keep looking at are the updated projections of how many headsets are going to be sold through to people by the end of next year, because that number gets thrown around in pretty much every random market report that's out there, and it's been steadily increasing. So I think the last one I saw said it was going to be between 11 and 15 million head-mounted display units that would be sold through by the end of 2016, which is a little bit faster than the adoption rate of the PS4, I think, if you look at a single year, or roughly in the same range at least. So that's pretty good for a new medium. If it's half of that, I think there will still be an opportunity for people to do some really cool stuff. And I think another thing that we're all going to have to be watching in terms of making decisions of how we're building out our roadmaps and what we're doing with our games is what platforms specifically those HMDs are. Are they all going to be Oculus? Are they all going to be Morpheus? Is there going to be some weird split where it's each a third? All of the platforms have slightly different capabilities right now. They're at least compatible enough, as Ben was saying, that we can probably support quite a few of them. But seeing how that all comes together will be a big piece.
This probably isn't a good answer, but it is a true answer. We really just haven't thought about it all that much. If we sell 0 copies of our game, we'll be kind of sad, but we've had a fun year working on it. We hope there's a market for this sort of stuff, and we've kept our investment in it, other than our own time, as low as we possibly can. So we've had fun doing it. If it completely fails, we'll sell it on PC.
Yeah, I'm sort of with Ben. My question has always been, can I muddle through this? And so far, Oculus funded me enough to get me through the first year. As of this morning, apparently, I've started selling my game. So I'm hoping.
Congratulations!
Thank you. I'm hoping that that's enough to allow me to continue doing this.
Thank you very much.
Hi. So personal projects and research aside, do you guys see a potential downfall? Not to bring the vibe down, but a potential downfall in all this, and sort of view it as a bubble, the same way that 3D TVs have sort of kind of been the thing that was marketed, but we're still not really seeing anything happen with that.
No, VR is going to be fine. I promise.
Yeah, I think that's a comparison that's drawn pretty often, but I do think VR is too cool to fail. It is substantially different from TV to 3D TV versus VR compared to everything else. Totally different comparisons.
Yeah, I think VR will be fine. It won't be all of the headsets that have been announced and will be announced. Not all of them are going to survive, but VR as a whole should be all right.
I think that the comparison is there. I've heard that actually a few times at GDC this year, of people saying a few years ago everybody was talking about 3D TVs and now everybody's talking about VR. I understand the comparison, but I think that people are talking about VR as a new medium more so than they are an accessory for existing stuff. And I think that mindset around it is pretty important to how people are perceiving it with regards to its ability to be successful in comparison.
I'm going to go back to my Cambrian explosion mixed metaphor, if you will. And I think, yeah, we will probably be due for an extinction level event or a great die-off. But to quote Jeff Goldblum, life finds a way.
Thanks,
right. Shout out, by the way, to Dave Vera, fellow San Diego indie. Give him applause, too. I think we have time for one more.
Hi, guys. First, thank you. This is a really good panel. I learned a lot today. Now, my main concern is that I'm hearing a lot of the same things that I kept hearing back in the day when augmented reality was the thing. What's the difference right now between augmented reality and virtual reality? How because I can see that you guys, well, this is the horse that we're betting on, but how sure can we be that this is the one that's going to stay and it's not going to fat out?
I want to jump in on this one real quick because I think AR and VR are two sides of the same coin. I ain't never ate a pancake so thin it didn't have two sides. And we're looking at a future definitely 5-10 years down the road. Who knows, maybe even sooner when we're all part of the Peter Thiel singularity consciousness, where they are the same thing, and you're going to have an augmented virtual experience.
I'm kind of surprised you didn't start with, back in the day when VR was going to be a thing, because VR already had its day and then died, and is now it's the VR zombie is coming back. But I think the tech is here this time. It wasn't ready before, and I actually think AR is all the technical problems of VR plus more, and so that's further in the future, I think. But yeah, the basic answer is VR is actually ready this time, and it wasn't.
In addition to that, right now the focus in all the buzz about VR is around content You need content if you want your thing to survive. The previous buzz around AR was mostly about interfaces. It was about seeing more data interfaces and scroll. Like, no one actually wants that. People want content, and that's what's happening this time.
Thank you.
All right, I think that's all the time we have. Thank you.
All right, so we're going to be across the way in the wrap-up room, and then also because he's not allowed to promote it, you should all go buy McNeill's game right now. Go buy Darknet.